In 1980, one American city posted the highest unemployment rate in the entire United States. Not Detroit, not Cleveland, not Youngstown. Anderson, Indiana, a city where 25,000 people had been on the General Motors payroll just 6 years earlier. 20% of the workforce, gone. And that's not even number one on this list. What's number one is a city that was once called the second Pittsburgh, a city that outproduced, outbuilt, and outgrew every rival for a generation, and then beat Detroit on the way down. Today, we're counting down 10 Indiana towns the steel industry built and then killed. If forgotten American cities are your thing, the kind of places where the ghost of what used to be is louder than anything happening now, subscribe. Before we get through number 8, you're going to want the rest of this map, 119 words. Number 10, Whiting. Whiting, Indiana is a town of roughly 4,500 people pressed between an active BP oil refinery and Lake Michigan. And the reason? It's only 4 to 500 is one afternoon in August 1955. On the 27th, a massive explosion tore through the Standard Oil refinery in Whiting, sending shrapnel into the Stiglitz Park neighborhood directly across the street. Windows shattered in Crown Point. Indianapolis Boulevard caught fire. One survivor described it years later. She thought the sun had exploded, that this was the end of the world. 2 people died, which is almost a miracle, but the neighborhood didn't survive. Standard Oil spent the next 2 decades buying up damaged and abandoned properties, one holdout at a time, until the entire Stiglitz Park neighborhood was leveled and replaced with oil storage tanks. A neighborhood where people had lived, eaten dinner, raised kids. Just tanks now. Whiting had been built in 1889 as a company town, literally laid out so workers could walk to the refinery. At its peak, the plant employed 8,000 people and was the largest refinery in the Midwest. During World War II, it produced boron-10, a material used in atomic bomb development. Almost nobody knows that. The town reached a population of around 10,000 before that single explosion effectively halved it overnight. Here's what gets me about Whiting specifically. It's not a city rotting from neglect. The BP refinery went through a multi-billion-dollar modernization as recently as 2013. Median home prices sit around $200,000 to $285,000. Not bad for this region. The town hosts a pierogi festival that draws hundreds of thousands of people. By Rust Belt standards, Whiting is functioning. But there's an entire neighborhood that used to exist and now doesn't, replaced by industrial tanks that sit where homes once stood. That's a different kind of loss than the ones we're about to get into. And honestly, it gets worse from here. Number 9, Portage. Here's a sentence that tells you everything about Portage, Indiana. The city was incorporated in 1959, the same year Midwest Steel opened. Not before, not after, the same year. Before that, the area was farmland and sand dunes on Lake Michigan. There was no Portage until there was steel. And that's not a metaphor. That's the literal origin of the city. What makes Portage's story particularly strange is that it's actually the story of 2 cities that never got built. The first one, in 1929, National Steel began buying land around Burns Ditch with plans to build a mill in a full company town they were going to call Port Williams, named after the president of National Steel. Land was purchased. Investors were told a new industrial city would rise from the dunes. Then the Great Depression arrived, and the whole vision died before a single foundation was poured. The ghost of Port Williams haunts Portage before Portage even existed. The second city that never got built. In 1974, Bethlehem Steel announced a $1 billion expansion that would have added 300 more workers and made Portage one of the most significant steel centers in North America. 1 year later, the steel recession killed it permanently. An entire planned expansion, the economic equivalent of a second city, simply never happened. Portage has about 37,000 residents today and still carries the Port of Indiana on its eastern edge. The Cleveland Cliffs Burns Harbor plant still operates. But when you drive through, there's a specific feeling. Wide roads built for traffic volume that never fully materialized. Commercial strips with gaps in them like missing teeth. This is a city built twice in imagination and once in reality. and the reality came up short of both. Number 8. Hammond. In 1979, Northwest Indiana's steel mills employed 66,600 people. 6 years later, that number was 38,300. That's not a recession. That's an amputation. And Hammond was standing at the center of it. By the early 1980s, Hammond's unemployment rate hit 20%, and its Messier at the time said the city went from record employment levels to a 20% jobless rate within just a few years. The city has since lost 26% of its population since 1970. Today, 96% of similarly sized American cities are growing faster than Hammond. Yeah, that's the kind of statistic that makes you put the car in park and just sit there. Hammond's industrial identity was built around Standard Steel Car Company, American Steel Foundries, and its role as the residential backbone for workers at nearby Inland Steel and U.S. Steel plants. At its economic peak, Lake County, where Hammond sits, generated 11.8% of all income in Indiana, while occupying only 1.7% of the state's land. That kind of density of production is almost hard to imagine now. Driving through streets of brick 2 flats built in the 1920s for Polish and Eastern European steelworker families who came and stayed and are now gone. Hammond today has roughly 75,000 people, a median home value around $173.00, and a child poverty rate of 34.8%. About 31% of all housing units were built before 1940, and only 2% after 2000. The city is 18 miles from Chicago, which provides some buffer. There's a casino. There's a lakefront park. The Hammond Historical Society president once described the city to a real estate website as having a bird-watching sanctuary, a sandy beach on Lake Michigan next to the Horseshoe Casino. And look, I don't want to make fun of that description because I understand what it's doing. When the industry that built your city is gone, you sell what you have left. I get it. But reading it still hits different when you know what was here before. Number 7, Muncie. Wait. Let me back up for a second, give you some context before we get to Muncie, because Muncie requires it. In the 1920s, 2 sociologists named Robert and Helen Lind chose a mid-sized Midwestern city to study as the definitive model of average American life, the archetypal American community. The city they chose was Muncie, Indiana, and their study was published under the title Middletown. They came back in 1937 and found it still thriving. Researchers returned again in the 1970s, and then again in the 2000s when they documented, in academic detail, exactly how badly the place had unraveled. There is no Indiana city whose fall from optimism is more thoroughly documented. Muncie's, which somehow makes it worse. Muncie, like Anderson, rode the Indiana gas belt boom of the late 1880s, a natural gas discovery that dragged 162 factories into the region within a decade. Ball Brothers, the Mason Jar Company, moved here during that boom. When the gas dried up, the auto industry stepped in. Borg Warner, then called Warner Gear, arrived. Chevrolet arrived. A constellation of parts suppliers followed. In 1995, Muncie still had 12,000 factory workers. By January 2020, only 3,900 remained. The Chevrolet plant that employed more than 3,000 people closed in 2006. Borg Warner, which had employed nearly 4,000, followed in 2009. The old Borg Warner factory off Kilgore Avenue. Somebody quoted in a Ball State magazine once said, "Sits barren after serving as a major work hub." And reading that sentence, there's a specific blankness in the language that tells you whoever wrote it was still a little stunned. Muncie has roughly 65,000 people today, down from over 83,000 at its peak. Ball State University is now the city's largest employer. The same city that was chosen as the model for all of American middle-class life is now primarily a college town. I don't know what the Linds would have made of that. I'm not sure I do either. Number 6, East Chicago. They used to call East Chicago the Arsenal of America, also the most industrialized city in the United States. Over 80% of its land was zoned for heavy industry at its peak. Inland Steel's Indiana Harbor Works employed 25,000 workers in 1969 alone. 25,000 people, in a city that today has 25,830 residents total. East Chicago was founded in the 1880s and grew so fast that by 1910 it already had 24,000 people. Inland steel expanded from 60,000 tons of capacity in 1903 to 1 million tons by 1917. Workers came from across Eastern Europe, Mexico, and the American South, packed into brick bungalows pressed right up against the mill fences. During World War I, they called it the Workshop of America. East Chicago's Indiana Harbor Works, now operated by Cleveland Cliffs, is still the largest integrated steel mill in North America. That's still true today. So this isn't a dead industry story in the traditional sense. The mill is running. The jobs just aren't. But here's the part that still doesn't sit right with me. In 1985, the Indiana State Department of Health documented dangerous levels of lead and arsenic in the soil beneath a residential housing complex called West Calumet, built on top of a former lead smelting site. They documented it. And then 31 years passed. It wasn't until 2016 that officials declared a disaster emergency and ordered 100 residents to evacuate. The children who had grown up playing in that soil tested elevated lead levels. The West Calumet housing complex was ultimately demolished in 2018. East Chicago has lost 55% of its population since 1960. Median home values sit around $105,000 to $117,000. The poverty rate is approximately 26%. The steel industry didn't just leave East Chicago. It poisoned the ground on its way out and waited 3 decades for anyone to do something about it. Number 5. Kokomo. Kokomo doesn't always get included in Indiana's Rust Belt Grief Tour, which is part of why it belongs here. It's easy to focus on the Lake County Steel Corridor and miss what was happening in the center of the state. Kokomo, Howard County, was an auto and steel parts city that by the mid-2000s was posting unemployment rates around 20% and earning the nickname from national outlets as one of the hardest hit cities in the country during the 2008-2009 auto crisis. At its industrial peak, Kokomo had Chrysler as its dominant employer. The city had earned the specific identity of being one of the auto industry's most productive transmission manufacturing centers. Delphi, the auto parts supply spun off from GM, had a massive facility here as well. When Chrysler and Delphi collapsed in 2008 and 2009, Kokomo was hit with a 1-2 punch that wiped out roughly 10,000 jobs in a city of 45,000 people. 1 in every 4 or 5 working adults, gone inside 18 months. What happened next is actually unusual for this list. Kokomo took federal stimulus money from the auto bailout and rebuilt. Fiat Chrysler's Kokomo transmission plant reopened. Employment recovered partially. The city has roughly 58,000 residents today, and its unemployment rate eventually dropped back to near national average levels. So why is it on this list? Because the population is still down nearly 20% from its 1960 peak of around 48,000. Wait, those numbers. Let me say this right. Kokomo peaked at over 48,000 people in 1970, and today sits just below that. The deeper story is in the economic character of the city, the decades of manufacturing dependence that left it completely exposed when the auto industry restructured. Here's the thing about a partial recovery. It looks like a success story from the outside. But talk to someone who sold their house for $60,000 in 2009, and you'll get a different answer. The scar tissue is there. It just doesn't always show from the highway. Number 4. Michigan City. Michigan City is one of those places that almost made it to a completely different future, and the almost is the whole story. Situated on Lake Michigan in LaPorte County, it started as a railroad terminus in the 1830s and grew around the Pullman Company's rail car manufacturing in the late 19th century, the same Pullman whose Chicago plant became infamous for the 1894 Pullman strike. Michigan City was the quieter satellite, producing rail cars, then pivoting towards steel fabrication and industrial manufacturing as the 20th century moved through it. The city reached its population peak of roughly 39,000 in 1970, then began the slow, unglamorous decline that defines every town on this list. It has around 31,000 residents today, down about 20%. The median home value runs around $130,000 to $150,000, depending on the year you check. The poverty rate sits at approximately 20%, and the city has persistent challenges with crime, vacancy rates, and school district underfunding that are the downstream symptoms of decades of manufacturing departure. Now, here's what people don't mention about Michigan City. It had something genuinely special going for it that most Rust Belt towns didn't. The Indiana dunes are right there. Lake Michigan is right there. In a different set of economic circumstances, Michigan City could have gone the Traverse City route, a former industrial town that leaned hard into tourism, recreation, and quality of life, and rebuilt its tax base around people who want to live somewhere beautiful. Michigan City hasn't fully made that pivot. The bones are there. The waterfront is underdeveloped. The downtown has a stubborn vacancy problem. And the gap between what this place could be and what it currently is might be the most specifically painful entry on this list, because it's not a story of total loss. It's a story of a chance that hasn't quite been taken yet. Number 3, Indiana Harbor. Indiana Harbor is technically a neighborhood within East Chicago. I know. East Chicago was already on this list. But Indiana Harbor deserves its own entry because it is functionally a separate industrial community with its own identity, its own timeline of rise and fall, and critically, it is home to what is still the largest integrated steel mill in North America operating today. The Cleveland Cliffs Indiana Harbor Works, running, still producing steel, employing roughly 4,000 workers where it once employed 25,000. That gap, 25,000 to 4,000, is what automation and globalization look like when they're rendered in human lives. The mill didn't die. The jobs did. The physical infrastructure of the most industrialized neighborhood in America is still there, still running, still producing. The community built around it contracted by 55% and was left with contaminated soil, demolished housing, and a poverty rate above 26%. Indiana Harbor is the most precise illustration on this list of the specific horror of post-industrial America. The production continues. The profit continues. The community that built it all gets left behind. Indiana Harbor also produced a specific architectural document of its past. The brick bungalows and 2 flats built in the 1910s and 1920s for steelworker families from Eastern Europe, Mexico, and the American South are still standing in neighborhoods where 44% of housing units predate 1940. Walking those streets on a weekday afternoon, when the mill is running, and you can hear it and smell it, and the sky above the facility has that specific color, the cognitive dissonance is something. The industry is right there. It never left. The community just didn't survive it. Number 2, Anderson. Here's the sentence I promised you at the top. In 1980, Anderson, Indiana posted the highest unemployment rate of any city in the entire United States, 20%, in a country in recession. In a country full of struggling Rust Belt cities, Anderson was at the bottom. 6 years before that, 25, zeros and people worked for General Motors across 20 plants in Anderson. The company controlled 40% of the American auto market, and Anderson was one of its most productive outposts, making headlamps, transmissions, and components that went into virtually every GM vehicle. 1 in 3 Anderson residents worked for GM. The city didn't just depend on General Motors. The city was General Motors. Anderson had started differently, with natural gas, of all things. The discovery of gas deposits in 1887 turned it into what a newspaper actually called the Pittsburgh on White River, earning it the nickname Queen City of the Gas Belt. The gas fueled glass factories and early manufacturing. When the gas ran dry by 1912, Anderson reinvented itself as an auto hub, and for the next 6 decades, it thrived proportionally to GM's dominance. Then GM's dominance eroded, plant by plant through the 1980s and 1990s. Anderson's facilities closed or relocated to Mexico, China, India, Brazil. The last one, Guide Corporation, a headlamp manufacturer, shut down in 2007. Anderson was left with more than 20 vacant factory sites, some contaminated with chrome plating chemicals so toxic they required $3.6 million in federal remediation funding just to begin addressing. Today, Anderson has roughly 56,000 people, down from its 1960 peak of 70,000. Median home value, approximately $130,000. Poverty rate, around 21%. The city has spent years converting former GM sites into logistics hubs and healthcare facilities with uneven success. And here's the detail I keep coming back to. Anderson, Indiana, in 1949-50, had its own NBA basketball team, the Anderson Packers, professional basketball, in a city so flush with industrial prosperity that it could sustain that. That same city, 30 years later, posted the worst unemployment rate in the country. The distance between those two data points is a specific kind of American tragedy. I don't think there's a statistic that captures it. You just have to sit with it. But we still haven't gotten to number one. And number one beats Anderson the same way Anderson beat everyone else. Number one, Gary. In 1909, a promoter described what was being built in Gary, Indiana as a second Pittsburgh, but smokeless, clean, and attractive. Let that land for a second. Someone looked at what U.S. Steel was constructing on the southern shore of Lake Michigan and thought, this is better than Pittsburgh. This is the future. Gary was built from nothing. Literally, in 1906, U.S. Steel purchased 9,000 acres of sand dunes along Lake Michigan and began constructing not just a mill but an entire city. Named after Albert H. Gary, the chairman of U.S. Steel, the city was incorporated in 1906 and the Gary Works opened in 1908. Within a decade, the Gary Works was the largest steel mill in the world. The steel that went into the Golden Gate Bridge, Gary's steel. The steel that framed the Empire State Building, some of it from Gary. The city's population exploded from nothing to 17,000 by 1910 to 55,000 by 1920 to over 100,000 by 1930. Workers came from Eastern Europe, from the American South, from Mexico. Entire neighborhoods formed by ethnicity and arrival date, Croatian, Greek, Black, Mexican, stacked around the mill like rings around a planet. At its absolute peak in the 1950s and 1960s, Gary's Gary Works employed over 30,000 people, and the city had a population of nearly 180,000. The tax base was extraordinary. The schools were funded. The department stores were packed. The famous Palace Theater hosted nationally touring acts. In 1967, Gary elected Richard Hatcher as mayor, one of the first black mayors of a major American city, a moment of such national significance that the election drew media coverage from across the country. Gary wasn't just a steel town at that point. It was a city with a future. And then, the steel. Foreign competition arrived in force through the 1960s and 1970s. Gary Works, which had never fully modernized its aging blast furnace infrastructure, couldn't compete with the efficiency of newer mills in Japan and Germany. U.S. Steel began layoffs. The tax base began to crack. The white middle class left for the suburbs, the specific pattern of racial white flight that gutted dozens of American cities. But in Gary, it happened with unusual speed and totality. By 1980, Gary's population had fallen to 151. Zeros in. Still large, but the trajectory was now unmistakable. The 1980s were catastrophic. Gary Works shed workers by the thousands. Unemployment in Gary hit levels comparable to Anderson, roughly 20%, but in a larger city, which meant the absolute number of devastated households was proportionally crushing. The downtown, once one of the most vibrant in northwest Indiana, began to empty. Buildings were abandoned. The Palace Theater closed. The Genesis Center, the grand hotel that had symbolized Gary's ambitions, shut down. By 1990, Gary's population was 116,000. By 2000, it was 102,000. By 2010, 80,000. Today, roughly 65,000 to 70,000 people. Down from 178,000 at the 1960 peak. That's a 60+% population loss in 60 years. Gary, Indiana has lost more of its population, proportionally, than almost any other Rust Belt city in America. Second only to Detroit. That's where the title comes from. Gary didn't just fall. It fell farther and faster than anywhere except Detroit. And Detroit gets all the documentaries. Gary gets the punchlines. Walk through downtown Gary today, and you'll find some of the most striking urban Decay photography in North America. if you're into that specific visual language of frozen time that abandoned buildings produce. City Methodist Church, a Gothic stone building that opened in 1926 and once seated 1,200 people, sits open to the sky now, its roof collapsed, trees growing from the nave floor. The old U.S. Steel headquarters building on Broadway, still standing, boarded. The Palace Theater, demolished in 1973, which was maybe the most honest acknowledgement that the era was over. Some of what was Gary is still physically there. A lot of it is just the shape of what was there. Median home price in Gary today, approximately $50, 0 to $65,000, depending on source and neighborhood. Poverty rate, approximately 32 to 38%. The Gary Works still operates. ArcelorMittal, now Cleveland Cliffs, still runs a facility on the original site, employing roughly 5,000 workers where it once employed 30,000. Here's the thing about Gary that I think gets lost in the ruin porn coverage and the jokes and the Wikipedia statistics. Somebody planned this city. Somebody stood on those sand dunes in 1906 and drew streets and parks and schools and churches and neighborhoods and believed, genuinely, that they were building something that would last. And for 50 years, it did last. It was real. 178,000 people built lives there. They raised families and opened stores and voted for mayors and bowled on Tuesday nights and sent their kids to school. The Gary Works helped build the physical infrastructure of modern America. The steel and bridges and skyscrapers and ships. Gary made some of that. And then the economics shifted. And the people who could leave did. And the people who couldn't stayed. And the city that was called a second Pittsburgh is now called a cautionary tale. I don't think that's the whole story. But I think that's the part we have to be honest about before we say anything else. If even one of these towns hit you differently, if one of them made you want to pull up Google Maps and just look, or made you think about someone you know from one of these places, or made you angry in that specific way that only happens when you realize something preventable wasn't prevented, drop the town name in the comments. I read every one of them. Tell me which one got you. Share this with whoever in your life talks about American manufacturing, or the Rust Belt, or why certain places got left behind and others didn't. This conversation deserves more people in it, and the subscribe button is right there. I've got more of these maps, more forgotten places, more cities that were promised a future and handed a different one. Come along for the rest of them. These towns aren't just history, they're a mirror, and the reflection is worth looking at.